You've had a pretty fascinating journey, and I've been trying to piece this together, looking at your LinkedIn, reading articles. First of all, I have no idea how old you are. I can't, you've either achieved a lot at a very young age or you're 50 and look the way that you do. So I can't figure this out from a timeline perspective. You've sort of gone from biotech and pharma into launching Myoform, which is incredibly exciting. So a company focused on precision nutrition. How has that all panned out? You don't have to tell everybody how old you are, but what's inspired all of this, and what's the journey been so far?
Yeah, so maybe I think we'll touch on this a bit later, but going like a long way back. So I grew up with a form of genetic hearing loss. So sort of had about 40 to 50% of my hearing as a kid. Also, I'm told, you know, my parents were always saying, hey, you know, you're not paying attention to us, you watch too much TV, you know, you don't hear us. Turns out there was a legitimate problem for the reason I wasn't listening to what they were saying. But it sort of deteriorated throughout childhood, and then I lost the remainder of my hearing on my right side around the age of 12-ish, which sort of, and throughout childhood, you know, and beyond that point, spent a lot of time kind of bouncing around the health system here in the UK. But really, that was kind of my first experience of sort of how genetics can impact your health. And, you know, as a result of spending a lot of time in the health system, grew sort of an affinity for that world, and eventually ended up doing my undergraduate degree in human biosciences and genetics at the University of Exeter here in the UK. And, you know, that was an extension of one, also being really interested in sports. So being dreadfully, you know, bad at, I would say, a kind of sports, and always trying to find kind of that performance, that 1% performance gain that I felt like I wasn't talented enough to really do anything with my sport, but was really keen on it. So I always played to a reasonable high level, but was never, you know, extremely effective. And I was always wondering, you know, are there areas that I could dive into that could make me a better athlete? And supplements were one of those areas that were super interesting. So I was always trying the latest thing out, and sort of by extension going into human biosciences as an area too. There was probably something in the background of my mind that was sort of saying to me, hey, maybe we can find something that I'm really good at, and then dive into that from an athletic perspective. But unfortunately, that wasn't the case. So I basically, you know, from there then dove into kind of the world of health tech, of pharma and biosciences, or biotech rather, through first WPP. So, you know, there was somewhat of an intent to go into the health world to utilize the content of my degree program, but ultimately it was one of the first jobs that I applied for within WPP, and the business as I joined was being acquired by WPP, the large kind of marketing and advertising conglomerate, and we were a group that then sat within, or was assimilated into, if people or listeners or yourself are familiar with WPP, largest sort of advertising and PR conglomerate in the world, sort of 200,000 employees, 10,000 agencies. And we sort of sat in their health practice group that was dedicated towards supporting life sciences businesses. And I eventually sort of through that work with that business ended up running a sort of a new spin out kind of group within other agencies like Ogilvy, specifically their health side, Gray, Young and Rubicam, VML. We sort of commercialized different digital products that existed across that group. So we weren't doing marketing and advertising, but we were acquired as a business to sort of see what kind of WPP could do in the more digital sort of SaaS age. So it was early on in the kind of software as a service sort of industry in a sense. And we would work very closely with pharmaceutical and biotech companies that wanted to work with sort of key opinion leaders in the world of, you know, kidney disease or Parkinson's disease. We would find and work or connect directly with those experts in those fields. And we sort of, my responsibility ended up being, you know, coming from a very early stage in my career, progressed very quickly into leading that group that was responsible for commercializing 7 products that we sort of went to market with. And we were sort of, I was, you know, sat in a room at sort of 24, selling enterprise into the senior leadership at Pfizer and GSK and AstraZeneca, which is great experience to get very early on in your career. And from that, I was effectively, so I spent about six years with them. I ended up being sort of approached by a company called Sanogenetics, based out of the UK, who just raised their Series B, and they were very much focused in precision medicine. So we'd worked with companies like that, but ultimately the the Sano was very specifically focused in how do we work and support companies that are developing gene therapies in both rare and common disease, particularly rare disease, lots in neuroscience. So I'm super optimistic about that world in the next sort of 10 years. The curative therapies coming out to support Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, ALS. There's some really exciting research there. So our role there, or my role there, was to lead the commercial team in, you know, commercializing that product and services that we had there, and kind of shuttle that business towards sort of their next sort of funding round. And really the kind of red thread through that, as I sort of referred to earlier, I've always been into my health and sort of fitness in a sense. And the thing that frustrated me a little bit around the pharmaceutical and biotech space, and you know, regulation is super important in these worlds too, but there was this lack of trickle down of some of these amazing technologies into consumer health, right? So trying to establish how can we improve people's wellness or performance or longevity, to use an overused phrase at the moment, by leveraging some of these technologies that are being used on the extreme end of the kind of spectrum with conditions that are, you know, ultimately do kill people, unfortunately. So with sort of the personalized supplement side, it kind of blends sort of Myoform blends this passion of health care effectively with sort of the precision medicine aspect of kind of what we do in that world, and then also looks at, okay, performance, sports science, exercise science, how can we improve people's performance by leveraging genetic sequencing, blood biomarker testing, you know, even the use cases of AI to create highly contextual insights for individuals based on all of that data. And so really that's kind of how I fell into what I was doing on the healthcare side, and the personalized supplement side was, hey, why don't we apply these same principles to consumer health, starting with supplements, and that might grow into many other formats. But for now, it's sort of it started as a passion project looking at my own health, but then sort of evolved into something that I think people, you know, are yearning for, especially in 2025 when we've got the likes of Function Health and Superpower and, you know, hundreds of blood testing companies that everyone's much more familiar with utilizing as technologies, but really lack that kind of next step of what do I do with this data? Like from a decision-making standpoint, it still ends up on the consumer for most of these businesses, although they're getting more contextual with insights with AI and things like that. But we wanted to provide a product that says, hey, there's all the data, it's interesting, but here's a product that solves for a lot of the things that you're asking us to do. And that's really where Myoform is today.
There's already so many keywords that you use that fit into the creatine conversation, right? And I think you're as excited as we are about the progression in science around especially sort of brain-related conditions, whether that is happening in later stages of life, but also things that children can be born with, actually. And we've had some interesting people reach out to us in the last couple of months that are looking for specific insights and advice about creatine for children that are born with things like DMD, which is a degenerative muscular disorder that only occurs in boys. And so I feel like there's this red thread for you, which is actually like, yes, let's make health more mainstream, but also not forget about these sort of smaller subsets of people that are living every day with pretty niche conditions, and most likely because of your own experience growing up with your hearing your hearing loss. It gives you the capacity to recognize that all of this stuff is going mainstream. There's also a lot of little groups of people that are like, hello, that would be really helpful for me, but nobody's making it available or tailoring it to our needs. So there's a lot of keywords that are floating around in our conversations at Jenerise through the creatine lens as well. And I would say it's really important to, yes, let things go mainstream and democratize them and more accessible for everybody. But sometimes you need something to be personalized for, you know, a certain group of people. But in your case, with Myoform, an individual person, right? Yeah. So yeah, it's super exciting. You can be really, really proud of this as well. I think it's absolutely fantastic. So how does this platform actually personalize supplementation? And I'm listening to you as a person that has never done any of these sort of blood sample in the mail, getting data back stuff. You know, Mark Hyman has quite a famous program in the USA. I have never even dabbled or felt remotely interested. So you're talking to somebody who has no experience with this. How does Myoform actually work in terms of like looking at genetics as well as lifestyle and then biometric data. And I'm sure all three of those things need to be quite well understood to accurately make a recommendation to somebody. Can you explain a bit more about that?
Yeah, for sure. So I think there's kind of four categories that I would say the data sets that we ingest fall into. So as you've already kind of alluded to, there's the genetic side, there's sort of lifestyle data, which is, to kind of describe that lifestyle and biometric data, self-reported feedback from individuals that we wouldn't otherwise be able to garner from various other data sets. So that has to be a piece of the process, and outcomes and things like that. Then we have blood testing as a format, and I can go into kind of why we use that as an add-on component rather than starting with blood. And then kind of the fourth piece is going back to kind of the performance side and outcomes. It's sort of the wearable data, and you describe them as kind of digital biomarkers or biometrics in a sense, but it's sort of a different set of data than the self-reported pure kind of feedback piece, which is what's my height, what's my weight, right? So kind of we start with this foundation of genetic sequencing. So whole genome sequencing is the approach that we use, and how that so whole genome meaning we look at 100% of your genome. The traditional or many consumer testing companies like 23andMe in the past have looked at using a very small panel of genes or an assay. So meaning they decide on what are the 90 genes that we think are important that we want to look at, and then we only measure those. And we provide a report, an outcome based on only those 90 genes, and then we discard the rest. We don't even actually, utilize or sequence them in a sense. We use kind of a small sort of assay or methodology that only sort of measures those. Part of the reason why we look at 100% of the genome is, one, we want to provide utility for the data beyond the use case for Myoform. So we don't necessarily report back like a 23andMe might on what is your Alzheimer's risk, because for us today, we're not a healthcare company. We don't, we're not a medical device company in the sense that, there are other use cases for that data, and people are going to be the experts in that space. What we're really focused on is wellness and performance. But, we can't, there right now, there's not enough clinical data to know what 99% of our genome really does, in a sense, because we've only sequenced the genome in its completion since I think it was 2001 in the sort of whole genome project, and since then lots of research has come out, and obviously research was being done in the past, but there's still tons of work to do in that world. So what we do is we give you all of that data, but we only personally look at a sort of handful of genes, sort of around the kind of 200 mark. And we start with that, and really the value that genetics can provide to you is that we could look at many different genes that are involved in sort of both the absorption, the transport, or the storage of specific nutrients. And then outside of that, we can also look at physical traits related to athletic performance or cognitive performance. So things like muscle mass predisposition, endurance training responses, strength, power. We can look at injury risks, ACL, sort of injuries. We can look at Achilles rupture risks, and so on. So we can look at sort of how your cartilage is modeled based on certain variants in the genes, and really how that kind of process works is, for going really sort of down to basic level biology, is your genes or your genetic code is the recipe from which our bodies are built, right? So biologically, proteins are built up of specific sort of items within, or genes within, or genetic sections within your kind of genetic code, and downstream from there, enzymes and every kind of molecule in our body is built up from that. And so when there are slight changes in that underlying code, that changes the shape of some of those proteins, the shape of some of those enzymes, and we know that when those shapes start to change, the sort of folding patterns change, the molecules don't quite fit together, as well as they could do from an efficiency standpoint. So as you start to layer on, let's say with vitamin D, for instance, if we look at the 7 steps of the metabolism of that molecule, sort of as you consume it, or as it's kind of produced endogenously as well, we can start to see reductions in efficiency of how you metabolize that or store that gene or absorb it, right? And so the reason we start with that is we can create this really wide lens of what could be your underlying biology. It doesn't necessarily tell us what's going on today, but it creates a risk score or a risk profile for an individual. And then from there, we layer on many other data sets like the lifestyle or self-reported outcomes through through questionnaires through our app. So we look at your height, your weight, your sex and gender, and all these things that have an impact on what your overall nutrient requirements might be. We look at your nutritional intake, so through food diaries and things like that. And so we get this we start to paint this more complete picture. I think about it kind of like a Facebook or LinkedIn profile, right? Oftentimes you'll start adding in some data and then it'll say you're 10% of the way there. If you get up to 30%, you'll be much more visible, for new people that are searching you, right? So as we layer on these other data sets, it becomes more and more precise over time. And then, when it comes to blood testing, we can look at a range of biomarkers. Although blood biomarker testing, part of the reason why we don't start with it and just use blood testing along with some self-reported data is because blood testing as a methodology, one, is quite high friction for consumers. So you either have to, if you've ever done a finger prick blood test, it's an absolute nightmare. Sometimes you have to have a hot shower before, you end up milking your finger for about 20 minutes, you knock over the little vial and it's quite difficult to manage. And with blood testing, you have to do it multiple times in order to really paint an accurate picture of what your biology looks like, right? Being able to assess over time how things are changing is vital to blood testing. Whereas from a genetic testing standpoint, it's a spit test and you never have to do that test again. And it creates directional input on how should you manage your nutrition, your supplementation, your training. And so, outside of that blood testing as well, there simply sometimes aren't very good biomarkers that we can measure in the blood that give you a good indication of your sort of nutrient status, so to speak. So I always use the examples of calcium and magnesium. Measuring them in the blood, they're typically very tightly regulated at the level of the blood. And so homeostatically, and that's just fundamental to our biology. They're involved in certain sort of metabolic reactions. And so your body inherently keeps them at this sort of tightly regulated state in order to avoid any kind of downstream issues. But they are predominantly stored in the bones and in muscle tissue. And so by measuring them in the blood, you actually don't get a very good picture of what your actual nutrient status for those are. And then in some cases, there just simply aren't available biomarkers that are both cheap or realistic enough to do at scale on a consumer basis. And plus, blood testing is very sensitive. So as I said, oftentimes you have to, many of these kind of molecules that we measure in the blood, hormones are a good example of this, tend to change throughout the day. Testosterone has this kind of binaural effect where you tend to see it rise in the morning and go down gradually towards the end of the day and again. And so there's this kind of fluctuation, and the same with sort of female hormones across the month as well. You have to ensure that you're testing on a regular basis at the exact same time in the very similar conditions in order to get reliable outcomes from that data. So when you're doing that en masse at scale for consumers, it's quite challenging to do. Not least to say that in order to test enough biomarkers, you have to get a lot of blood. And so often that requires an individual going down to a clinic somewhere and getting their blood drawn. And if you do the at-home version, you just don't really get enough or a wide enough variety of biomarkers. So that's why we start with genetics. Blood is still a valuable metric to look at, but it just has its flaws, much like genetics does too. But we just choose to start with genetics as it's a lower friction move for consumers. And then sort of the last sort of aspect is we look at sort of what are the outcomes that the individual wants to consume, to achieve. That's extremely important from a supplementation standpoint, right? If you tell me you're doing an Ironman in 6 months, it's going to be a very different set of things that are important to you than if you are just trying to train a couple days a week and stay healthy, right? So context is important in that domain. And then when we look at wearables, really the content of wearable data that we think is important is how on an ongoing basis can we measure the efficacy of the products that you're taking? Because most of the time we're taking things blind, one from just the fact that we're going down to the shop, whether it's a GNC or Holland and Barrett's or wherever you get your supplements online. We're taking those without much knowledge of what I should be doing biologically. And then also we're taking them without any knowledge of how does this impact my performance in an ongoing way. So for us with wearables, we can look at how is your sleep score improving when you're taking Myoform versus when it's not, or how's your recovery or HRV or adaptation to your training changing, or VO2 max and things like that. So we utilize that as a metric to say to an individual, hey, you can actually have some data attached to when you're taking it versus not. And because genetic sequencing does take a little bit of time to complete, it's sort of often around the 4-week mark. we can get an accurate baseline during those 4 weeks where you're not having any changes to your training regimen or your current biology. And then by the time you receive your Myoform, we can start to map how those things change. And when you don't take that supplement, then how does that affect sort of that consistency of those scores? So really how we then start to personalize the products off the back of that is we sort of ingest that with all of the kind of currently available clinical literature across sport and exercise science, nutrition science, and kind of format that into a well understood sort of decision making model of what supplements should you be using, at what dosage, and when should you be using them, right? So all of that data kind of indicates then, you know, both the ingredients that we use and the dosage and the protocol in which we define the use of them. So you know, because I kind of think about the 4 horsemen of what is really important when it comes to supplements. It's outcomes. You know, you kind of going back a step, you always hear, and I'm sure you guys get this a lot, is, you know, the traditional kind of medical system or healthcare system, you often hear doctors say that supplements are useless, right? You know, it's expensive urine, you're just taking it and you're just urinating it out. But actually, supplements encapsulate such a wide category. It's not just vitamins and minerals, it's creatine, it's caffeine, and there's so much data that encapsulates the efficacy of those products. And so by saying, you know, supplements just simply don't work, it's not an accurate statement. But why they work and how they work is what outcome you are trying to achieve, and let's target that. What are the ingredients then should we use to target those? At what dosage? Because if you're just taking a sprinkle of creatine, it's not really going to have a massive effect. You know, and then also the you know, who are you buying them from as well? You know, we see, and I'm sure you guys have seen this a lot with the gummy fiasco. There's, you know, many products that just simply don't have the right ingredients in, or they might be taking the wrong format that necessarily doesn't have as much data behind it. So there's a ton of things that kind of go into that, but we ingest all of those components, contextualize it in the context of what the individual would like to achieve, and then provide the product and ship that out on subscription. So there's a lot of sort of long-winded way of saying how we kind of personalize things, but there's a lot that does go into it. And, you know, you want to create the most accurate representation of an individual in order to be able to provide those products. And so we try and take it all into account.
Wow, I'm getting like a private webinar event here. That was outstandingly well articulated and incredibly interesting. And it brought a lot of questions to my mind. I'll try and just run through what my questions were as you were talking. At one point, I wanted to ask you, why have blood tests become the go-to mainstream, sort of like practitionally recommended and default test? Why has that happened throughout time? And then secondly, I was also thinking, as a consumer, we're often kind of experiencing loose health problems and looking for a product, but we don't know what is going to help. And at the same time, we're being marketed things that we might not need, but we buy out of some sort of like commercially provoked emotional feeling. So we're kind of buying stuff we might not need whilst looking for stuff that would actually help, and we don't know. And I think that's just becoming more and more of a thing. So those are 2 questions that I had as you were speaking. And then sort of to summarize, to me, it sounds like you're actually also going to be able to allow people to potentially cut back on buying random stuff to some extent, you know. And I mean, you and I kind of live and breathe in this space, and I'm in the creatine bubble, and even I feel impacted by, do I now need fiber? Do I now need, and you kind of have to put yourself in the shoes of just the average Joe, you know, who has much less expertise and sort of industry knowledge. I think that's a very overwhelming position to be in when you're thinking about the mass consumer. And that's why a lot of things in the supplement space do get kind of brushed off, because people don't really know if they need it, and they don't really know if it's helping, and they don't really know if it's worth the money. And one of my other final thoughts as you were speaking was that I believe that this is one of the reasons why women, but men also, continue to spend so much money on cosmetics, makeup, because we use it and we see an immediate difference. I can spend £30 on a concealer. My husband thinks I'm crazy, but I'm like, yes, because I can put it on my face and I see the difference.
Yeah.
You can take creatine for 20 years and still be wondering, like, has this helped me? Is this one of the reasons why I feel strong or not?
Yeah.
And you're never really going to know. And it's kind of hard as somebody in the industry to explain that as such a believer. in certain supplements for certain people at certain times in their life, it can make a world of difference, and it can keep you out of the doctor's office, right? I interviewed Suzanne Mitchke, and she said supplements are there to help keep healthy people healthy, right? And by the time you're in the doctor's office, it's like it's kind of gone too far. Do you know what I mean? So I absolutely love everything that you explained, and it addresses an awful lot of interconnected points, both in the wellness space, but also in consumer behavior. I'm a brand girl, right? So I'm looking at this through a consumer perspective, especially with Black Friday, which has become Black Week, become Black Month. Like, we're all just buying stuff, trying to feel better, supplements included. I've seen nearly every brand do some sort of deal in the last week or so. I haven't bought anything. I'm strong. I bought some shoes because I know the shoes will make me feel cool immediately when I wear them next week. I don't know if a new collagen or a new whatever, so it's such a double-ended thing. And even as an industry insider, I can appreciate that. So for the average consumer, I think it's mind-boggling, to be quite honest. And for that reason, I can see Myoform as being something that is incredibly helpful in terms of just giving people the confidence and the clarity, and also to help people stay committed to keep taking something, right? So anyway, that's my 2 cents in response to your amazing explanation. Let's talk about creatine for a sec. So
let's do it.
I know that you have put together, created, I don't know, a report. I was excited to see that come down my LinkedIn feed. It's a hot topic, not just in my world, but across the board. At the end of this year, I think we're finishing this year in a place where more people are talking about creatine than ever before. Through your lens, as the Myoform guy, how is genetic variation actually maybe affecting an individual's ability to synthesize, store, and utilize creatine? And we can look at that then not just as supplementation, but also just the naturally produced creatine. I think for anybody listening, it's important also to remember that our bodies produce about 1 gram of creatine a day. That's a huge generalization. Women, it's a bit less throughout the month, as Theo mentioned as well, like with your hormonal cycle, that's going to be completely different throughout the month for women. But let's kind of talk about that. You kind of got your naturally occurring creatine, and then we've got the supplementation. You might be taking 3 to 15 grams extra on a daily basis. So what has Myoform learned about this? What's your kind of ethos on it as we stand today?
Yeah, so actually, am I able to share my screen? Do you mind if I share?
Yeah, go ahead. Wow, yeah.
Sure. So I use this a little bit in some of the presentations that I've done recently, just by virtue of the fact that it's, funnily enough, on creatine specifically. So I thought it's a good example of something to use. So just kind of to roll back almost like the principle of Myoform in the first place, there's this great paper that looks at dose response between sort of creatine supplementation and fat-free mass index, or fat-free mass in sort of kilos specifically in different individuals. So a lot of historical creatine data has kind of shown that about 25% of people are kind of non-responders to creatine, or considerably less lower responders. And my question has always been why creatine, but also if you look at any sort of clinical paper in relation to nutrition, it's very typical in this, but just generally in any kind of scientific intervention paper or study or clinical trial, you see this kind of scattered distribution around a mean of responses. And I think it's super fascinating to me. And this is kind of the why Myoform exists is, we take, science itself, and this is maybe a controversial statement, but I think we're kind of getting to a point now where perhaps the scientific method in some ways is no longer sort of serving our health in a particularly productive way. I mean, there was a paper that came out a couple months ago on kind of the first time now that in the US, especially obesity rates are declining, but generally, all-cause mortality has kind of been going up for a variety of different sort of disease states as well. So, but I look at this paper specifically, and you see, each one of these dots is an individual, and we as scientists tend to run these studies and we apply statistical analysis, and we kind of take the mean and apply guidelines for the average person. So we think about sort of that typical 3 to 5 grams a day of creatine that has been recommended, typically on body weight and things like that. But my question is always kind of what about the kind of needs of all of these people that sit well beyond the standard deviation, right? You have these hyper responders to creatine, and then you have this person down the bottom, poor person, that's barely responded at all. In fact, they've actually lost fat-free mass in this case. So Really, with Myoform, what kind of my mind goes to is, one, why might that be the case, that there are these hyper responders and lower responders? And in science, we describe these people typically as anomalies. You know, they sit so far outside of standard deviation, but there's so many of them, right? Like, they can't possibly all be anomalous, right? So, you know, for me, it's these people down here might just, the dose might not be enough based on what they did in this paper, and these people, you know, it's more than enough. Or, you know, what would it look like as we start to increase it, and so on. So, I'll stop sharing there, because I think it's actually, I won't stop sharing. There's one thing I've got after this slide that's useful. But as we start to think about why might this be the fact, genetics is a pretty important part, and you can obviously talk about nature versus nurture and lifestyle and how those things impact. But we know for a fact, based on a lot of clinical data, why people might be you know, worse at absorbing or storing or metabolizing, as I referred to earlier, specific nutrients. And creatine is one of those nutrients that you could look at, the whole kind of metabolism chain, if I go to the next slide, of basically how creatine is sort of produced endogenously. So inside our bodies, I know you guys have lots of educational content on this. Creatine is kind of built up of multiple sort of amino acids, particularly glycine and arginine. And there's a sort of enzyme involved in the conversion of or in that metabolic process of combining those two sort of ingredients, called the sort of GATM, or the gene related to the production of the enzyme is GATM. And then sort of guanidino acetate then combines with sort of another enzyme and a methyl group to produce what is creatine. And obviously, as you supplement, you know, those things support it. But ultimately, there's lots of different steps in this process that we could look at from a genetic component to see what is the efficiency of the rates of the production of these. And we know, based on some kind of rare conditions where there is severe creatine deficiency, it's triggered by a genetic event. And of course, those are extremely rare, but there are variants that may affect the rate, and have been shown to affect the rate of kind of production of creatine. Maybe not on a clinical deficiency level towards, you know, it's extremely dangerous, but to an extent that it is important for someone to supplement. So we could look at each of these different steps as sort of geneticists to understand where might someone have a lower level of efficiency. And so sort of when it relates to GATM, that's kind of the first one that we can look at. That's kind of the combination. Obviously, you can look upstream from this even to look at glycine production and arginine and so on. And this can kind of go upstream or downstream as far as you want. But where the clinical data is today, kind of we look at GATM and some other kind of areas. So GATM encodes for effectively the enzyme, which is the arginine glycine. I'm going to get this wrong, amidinotransferase sort of enzyme that's kind of used in that step of converting glycine and arginine into creatine. And so we know that sort of low levels of this enzyme result in an increased risk of things like muscle pain with statin use even. So there's some interesting research in that space. But researchers effectively believe that it's due to this decrease in creatine synthesis endogenously. And with this, also there's these kind of extreme deficiencies that can cause sort of mild to moderate intellectual disability, delayed speech, and things in sort of developmental stages. And so that's kind of the first step. So we use that as a metric to say what variant of this gene or SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms, might be affecting the structure of that enzyme and how it's encoded, and then hence how it functions. Because if the enzyme doesn't fit the molecule effectively, then it's not going to be quite as efficient at converting those two molecules or into kind of creatine. And then sort of you can look downstream. So you see GAMT there combines with the methyl group. And so methylation as a process, for people that don't know, is effectively kind of the biological process where a carbon and that's bound to sort of 3 hydrogens then is bound enzymatically to specific molecules that then makes specific molecules or said molecule more bioactive or bioavailable, for instance. So it helps it do a variety of things, and is often referred to kind of as the mechanism for sort of regulating the expression of specific genes. And in particular, people, you'll hear methyl groups or MTHFR or methylation in relation to kind of biological aging. And so methylation as a process tends to, after we kind of are fully developed, starts to decrease over time because of the fact that our body becomes less effective at methylating as a kind of process, and so we get worse at metabolizing nutrients, at clearing out cell damage, or at regenerating cells. So our sort of methylation is a process that also occurs on the DNA to effectively upregulate or downregulate the expression of specific genes. And so as we get older, our ability to regulate genetic sort of components sort of is decreased. And so And we know for a fact that sort of creatine synthesis is extremely sort of metabolically burdensome. So it's responsible or consumes about 40% of the body's methyl groups. And so if you have a poor process for creating methyl groups, then it's a higher likelihood that you will have a lower circulating level of sort of creatine kinase in the muscle tissue as well, and also in the brain, as you kind of mentioned. So the MTHFR gene is highly indicated in creatine synthesis. Typically, it's also referred to with B vitamins, so folate and B6 as well. But GATM or GAMT, it's annoyingly similar sort of names, encodes for another enzyme, which is then obviously essential in that step 2. And there are studies of models that shows kind of partial deficiency as possible as well, but it's very rare to find particularly negative variants of this in the process. So as we kind of look up that metabolism chain, our ability to process or metabolize or produce creatine endogenously can go down. And then if we look at actually the use of creatine itself in the muscle tissue or in the brain, there's something called the CKM gene, which encodes basically for the mitochondrial type of creatine kinase, so the enzyme that's responsible for the breakdown of creatine or creatine phosphate in the muscle tissue, or phosphocreatine. So that enzyme then sort of converts phosphocreatine into sort of the process whereby it regenerates, or the splitting of those kind of two molecules, the phosphate, inorganic phosphate, and the creatine itself, and regenerates sort of ATP from there. So again, different variants of that may decrease the efficiency of that enzyme to break down that process. And so from a Myoform perspective, we create what's called a polygenic risk score. And we do this across all of the nutrients and kind of components or reports that we generate. And that's to say, out of multiple variants, can we create a score that then gives us an indication or a directional indication of how effective this individual is at both metabolizing, utilizing, and storing creatine, and then we make recommendations off the back of that from a supplementation standpoint, along with all the other components. So, sleep deprivation, and if someone is sleeping less than 6 hours a night, should we up that? So we have a kind of and then when it comes to building muscle, should we adjust the kind of dosage of that? And then when it comes to weight and sex and gender and all those kind of things, all these components can sort of have an effect on how we dose creatine, but ultimately we want to provide information to individuals and then utilize that information to kind of then inform how we dose and utilize it, because there's some very big differences based on what we can do. So the science isn't perfect yet in understanding all of these components, but we want to get more directional than what is currently being done, which is, I don't know what to do. I'm going into a shop and buying a product that I don't necessarily know why or how. It's just there. My local influencer has told me this is what I need, so I'm going to go and do that. And so we're going, okay, here's all this information. We're doing the science, we're doing the calculations, and we can evolve that over time based on your changing objectives effectively. So yeah, hopefully that's a useful sort of demonstration of how we use kind of creatine synthesis, because genetics can play a pretty massive role in the process.
Thank you. And it's fascinating. Even for me, this genetic component is quite a new topic, which is why I've been so much looking forward to speaking with you today. And it even gives me the comfort in understanding how natural creatine is. Obviously the creatine that we buy in the stores, yes, it's synthesized. We do not extract creatine from animals, like a meat-based variety, and that's not available. So a lot of people have concerns about creatine being natural or not. And actually, I'm quite convinced that a lot of people that take creatine as a supplement maybe don't even understand that it is a naturally occurring, like, molecular component of our body's natural makeup. And so it is really fascinating to learn how essential it is in the body's functioning, even without even supplementing at all. Because as soon as you start talking to people about supplementing iron, they get that, because it's just common knowledge that iron is in our blood, and as soon as that starts to become too low of a count, you have some problems. But creatine's not quite there yet, like in the mainstream perception. People see it as such a sort of out-of-body ingredient, and it's one of the main goals that I have with our webinar and all of our education stuff, is helping people understand that it's naturally occurring in your body. Your body knows what to do with it. It's there, like from conception in the womb. Your little fetus body has creatine, like it's always part of you, in the same way that proteins and all sorts of other things, and iron and different minerals are. And so I think that disconnect is still holding quite a lot of people back from feeling safe, actually, about consuming creatine. There's a lot of work to be done, and this kind of content is really, really fascinating. I'm getting ideas that for our next webinar, I'm going to have a side chat with you about doing a session in our next webinar.
I mean, to your point, it's so essential by virtue of the fact that the data, you know, studies where we can see that those genes have been knocked out, right? You know, an individual, a child that's born that has a gene knocked out that affects their ability to produce creatine results in severe developmental issues. And so we know how much of an impact it has in the absence of creatine. But then I also have maybe a slightly controversial opinion of supplements generally, in that I actually think supplements are often better than whole food at you know, eliciting a specific effect. You know, if we want to increase our creatine, you can get that through the diet, but actually sometimes taking creatine through a supplement is just a much more effective way of doing it without all of the extraneous caloric intake you might need, or saturated fat, or whatever that might be. So it's you know, as I say, for some people, you naturally might be a low responder to creatine anyway, and can get massive benefits out of utilizing it, or having a higher dose than someone else. Like we were talking earlier about my lack of sleep over the last couple of days due to some bad sort of travel and jet lag. And so I've been taking sort of 20 grams of creatine the last 2 days in order to kind of, you know, counteract the cognitive decline effects of the lack of sleep. And there's well-documented data that continues to come out around that. I'm not going to be able to get 20 grams of creatine from eating, you know, a ton of red meat. And if I was, I'd be, you know, very unwell. So, you know, there's these kind of benefits that we can get from supplementing rather than just taking whole foods, that I think is sometimes lost in the language of when everyone says, oh, you may as well use whole foods, and supplements are by design supplementing your diet. But actually, I think in some cases there should be a standalone component of your diet where it's super essential and can really benefit you beyond the use case of you know, just eating your vegetables. I think we're kind of past that point now of our biological understanding of these things. And so kind of going back to what you said earlier about kind of, you know, buying things and consumerism and things, I think it's helping people get directional on what they need to sort of should be using. I mean, I'm a nerd and get really excited about new products, and, you know, buying a ton of supplements, and I still do, even though I take my kind of Myoform on a daily basis and have been doing for the last 2 years. I still get excited about new things. I think that's just kind of human nature. But you know, taking something that's consistent, that you know is having a benefit, and someone's done all the science behind it prior to you taking it, rather than just relying on kind of what's there, you know, relying on a marketing gimmick, I think is super valuable. And, you know, with Myoform, what we try and do also is then have that product evolve over time. Every 3 months, we adjust the formulation based on feedback into the system. So it's kind of that next iteration that I think we all know is coming from a supplement standpoint. It's just, you know, being able to crack that volume of data that you have, and then downstream utilize it in a way that's useful for an individual, that isn't just, you know, scientifically inclined. It's how simple can you break down the language and just provide a product that solves for those things. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting space at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And what we're looking at is next year expecting so many more creatine ready to consume products hitting the market. There's been a wave of that already. We've seen the cereals, we've seen the puddings, we've seen the bars, hot chocolates, all of these things. That's just going to continue. And it's very divisive, because you still have a huge group of people that just want to dry scoop creatine, have it with their water, because they understand the benefits and they truly see it as a supplement, and food as something separate. Food is a meal to satiate my hunger, my calorific intake, and probably also a moment to enjoy, maybe in a social setting. Creatine I take in the morning. It's an act of service to myself. Doesn't have to taste good. I can just get it down my neck and then I take that off my box. That is still a huge group of people. And then you have people that are very much wanting to have a biscuit in the afternoon that's got some creatine in it. And so from my perspective with Jenerise, it's like making sure that these different types of consumers are all aware of creatine and understanding it equally. I'm not here to necessarily tell people in what way they should consume it, and there's different schools of thought. As you said yourself, you're much more of like a supplement, SAR2 supplement, and my food intake is something kind of different, the role that plays in your life. For me personally, if I look at my food intake through the lens of, am I getting all of the nutrients that I need? it takes a lot of the joy out of food for me, and can even sort of lend itself to some sort of like disordered type of mentality about my sandwich. You know, I like to take my supplements, know that I've ticked the boxes before lunchtime with my protein, my creatine. I can give you the rest of my stack. It's not outlandish. I don't take a lot of stuff. And then I can kind of eat well, but I am not concerned about my, you know, protein in my dinner, because it's I kind of ticked that box. But some people do not enjoy living like that. They don't want a medicine cabinet in the kitchen full of powders and concoctions and droplets and liquids and pills, and I completely understand that. You know, so yeah, are we going to get to a place where creatine is in Snickers bars and Pop Tarts? Kind of, yes. I mean, if we're following in the footsteps of protein, that's where this is going. I'm not here to sort of say that that's a good thing or a bad thing, but I do truly believe that hundreds of millions of more people should be taking creatine on a daily basis. And if you want to eat a Pop Tart, the one with creatine in it is going to be somewhat of a better choice than the one without it in there. So, but it's personal, and I think that's kind of the bottom line of our whole conversation here, is that health is a personal thing. Our bodies are all different. When you showed me that graph just now, and those outlier sort of radical people that don't fit into the standardization of the results that you're getting from these studies and what have you, that's just fascinating. And when you think about how the recommended standard right now is 5 grams of creatine, it's like, yes, okay, that's not dangerous, it's safe, you can do that, that's fine and great, do that instead of not taking it by all means. But also, like, there's going to be moments in your life where you need more, you might want to stop, you know. And so it's not a one size fits all kind of thing. As with anything, I would beg to differ. So what are some of the biggest misconceptions that you see in the supplement and wellness space at the moment? Maybe specifically to personalization. Obviously, don't want you to throw any other brands under the bus here, but what are you kind of seeing that's not fully clicked yet?
So I think some level of personalization is always going to be better than none. And so even if it's a brand that's just doing a questionnaire and then directing people towards existing products, I think that's still better than walking into Holland & Barrett's. And I mean, you know, Holland & Barrett's being in the UK or GNC or, you know, anywhere else, not to sort of knock the, you know, them, but oftentimes the people that work there have had like 2 PowerPoint presentations worth of training, and then they're responsible for like directing people towards like products, and they've got no scientific background at all. I think that's better than relying on an influencer that, you know, is you know, acting in their best interest. But I think personalization to an extent, along with providing information to them and educating people, is empowerment of consumers. I think we tend to act in a way, especially, and again, I don't want to just sort of disavow sort of medical doctors and the kind of traditional healthcare system, but I think we, you know, it's often that we rely on those people for nutritional information as well, and they have less than 4 hours of optional training throughout their sort of 7-year sort of qualification to become a medical doctor. So often it will kind of be supplements don't work, so don't bother, as opposed to starting the conversation around, well, what do you want to achieve, and let's work backwards from there to see what could be beneficial. Because as I said earlier, when it relates to sporting performance, creatine is one of the most research products in the world, and if you're not taking it, you're losing out on a massive potential benefit, because you just fundamentally are going to really struggle to get enough through your nutrition. And if you listen to traditional medical advice, it's you know, the medical system typically is built upon an algorithm of let's avoid doing any harm, as opposed to how can we optimize, right? And inherently it's going to be in a risk averse culture, and I think they haven't had enough training to recommend those things. So I think you have to rely on kind of consumer businesses at some stage to kind of support with that. But as I say, if you're providing that personalization effect and providing information as to why those decisions have been made, I think that's a really valuable thing for consumers. And I think misconception wise is, you know, we get this question a lot, is, well, how can you know, like, where's the evidence, or what's the, you know, how can you prescribe supplements based on just genetic information? And I would say we can't, because we're not just ingesting genetic information. You don't know enough about an individual from just looking at their genome. You can know a lot of things, but you can't understand like what their lifestyle looks like and other things. You can kind of, because your genetics is kind of prescribed in a sense, if I can use that word, at birth, or even prior to birth. It's sort of a gamete level. So you can take that information and use it to get directional about where you kind of go next, and it's better than just relying on some random influencer, because there's so much misinformation, there's misinterpretation too, there's kind of multiple types of misinformation or disinformation, where it might be unintentional misconstrusion of the conclusions of studies or data within studies too. So it requires kind of, I think, a different lens from a company or organization that's dedicated towards interpreting the mass of clinical literature and kind of creating a certainty score, in a sense, around our knowledge of that. So I think misconception wise, it's how can you personalize? We don't know enough. I think it's and I would agree in some cases it's about getting more directional than it is about being precise, because there's the old adage of roughly right is better than precisely wrong, right? We want to give people, you could get those insights as well from just what is it you want to achieve, and a coach kind of taking you through that process. But if you want to be really good at, or if you want to get more precise, you can start to dive into these biomarkers like genetics and bloods and others. And as I pointed to earlier, there's negatives or associated with many of those processes, right? None, there's no solutions, only trade-offs, right? None are perfect, but I think we start here and then we kind of grow. I think a study that was released really recently, Aura rings, smart rings, released a paper looking at 8,000 pregnant women, and it's the most in-depth biometric insight into the kind of overall sort of pregnancy cycle for women that we've never had access to in our lives. And sometimes it requires, the medical industry, having worked in clinical trials, that's an incredibly challenging undertaking in order to get 8,000 women that are pregnant now, and getting them to record their biometrics for 9 months throughout the kind of end-to-end process. That's unprecedented. And they didn't, Aura didn't set out to say we want to do that, but by virtue of the fact that their business model is going to consumers first and then building the research basis off that, science in itself, we expect to be perfect from the off, and we expect it to tell us yes or no. But actually, there's hundreds of conflicting papers that show that broccoli consumption is beneficial, but it's also negative in some connotations, right? So you can, I think there's a Daily Mail, Daily Mail is probably a bad example, but there's countless examples of papers that kind of show a counter effects based on what it is they're looking at. So I think it's, let's start here and grow. But misconception wise, I think it's mainly around, can you actually do this? Is the science strong enough? And my argument's always it's to an extent that our belief is absolutely we can make highly specific recommendations, but it's only going to get better from here. And sometimes it requires a business like ours to go and do that first, and then enable kind of the further insights that we get, because we collect so much information about an individual. We can start to build this new proprietary research engine that then contributes to the clinical literature beyond the use case for what we're doing today. So I think it's we're a bit too harsh on businesses sometimes that are trying to get more or do better than what is traditional. And I think this is definitely better than what's traditionally out there.
I'll add, science is a process, right? There's no arrival destination with science. I actually think the world might be quite a boring place if there was some arrival point of like, right, we figured it all out, we know everything, we're done. And that's just not the case. And, with what you're doing, I mean, if you stay in this company that you've now founded and are running, if you do this for another 10 years and we have this conversation again, I mean, it'll just be absolutely crazy where you've landed, and I think it's just acknowledging in the nutrition, wellness, health space, whether you're looking at like biology or ingredients, there's no arrival point. There's not like a hurrah we made. There's like a made it moment where you're achieving your company mission. But as far as the science that is establishing all of it being possible, there's no arrival moment with all of that. And I think people are very critical about that. And they'll look at one study and be like, what does this mean for your company? And I'm like, well, it's just another stepping stone in this really pretty massive journey that that we're on. And I think it's nice to acknowledge that, and sort of it's fun to be in the space of playing a role in the evolution of what Myoform is doing, but likewise for Creatine. It's just an honor to be playing a role in the progress of it all, really. takes a bit of risk, and you have to want to kind of be in the weeds of it all and in the thick of it. But I think you're doing a great job.
For sure.
To summarize for the recorded part of the conversation for today, I would love for you to share with the audience, if anybody out there is curious about testing their own genetics for supplement optimization, how would you recommend they get started? Is Myoform already available, or are there some sort of other separate things that people can do even today on their own terms? Where can people get started if this is something they're interested in?
Yeah, so I think I would obviously always, recommend what we do. We are currently available, so we've been active. So we have a wait list that's been open for quite some time, and we've kind of been continuing to bring people through that. But we are planning to open it up to the public at the beginning of the new year, which I think will be coming out sort of around this time. So, if people are listening or watching or reading, we are currently available. So, I would definitely, suggest coming to us. We do have the capability to either upload any existing genetic testing, although, as we mentioned before, sometimes it's not quite as precise as utilizing our methodology, but we don't want people to duplicate work and duplicate spend where perhaps they don't need to. But we do whole genome sequencing, and there's a number of other companies that do offer whole genome sequencing. So I would just say Google whole genome sequencing, and we can utilize that data too. But I would say we're kind of definitely on the lower end from that methodology perspective, from a price perspective, because we don't think about making money on the genetic testing. Really, we want to support you on the supplement journey, because that's the thing that's really going to move the needle. Of course, there's behavioral changes you can make, and there's recommendations to our system that we can sort of add in just based on the genetics. But if you really want to support your health, we want to get you utilizing supplements that we think are really, really effective for you, and help you make those decisions in life. So you can use us, and in terms of what you can expect to learn from the platform itself. So we provide these really in-depth health insights reports on everything from your vitamin A through to your magnesium, your calcium requirements, your creatine, your omega-3s, and then also, as I mentioned prior, looking at sort of physical traits as well. And we're constantly adding new reports to that. I think back in October was creatine. This month it's more than likely going to be vitamin K. And so we're constantly adding new reports based on the latest available clinical literature. And also these things change. So like we just mentioned, science isn't a perfect process, and sometimes new research comes out that maybe either is additive or contradicts or changes our understanding of previous papers, as it's all about sort of extrapolating potentially some of those insights. So for us, we're constantly adding new data, and we don't charge for the subscription to the platform. It's sort of a you get your data, you can also download it and utilize it for any other use case, but ultimately we provide kind of an ongoing insight basis, and we're releasing some very exciting new features around sort of training programs and other things too, based on all the data that we collect. But ultimately, it's about getting a better understanding of your biology from a directional standpoint, and then obviously getting a hold of some supplement products that can really support you. And it's a single scoop product that encapsulates multiple different ingredients based on all the data we can understand about you. And we also provide the breakdown of the research and the justification of the inclusion of those. So it's really about getting clear on why you're using these products, at what dosage, at what frequency, and then getting feedback and actually feeling if they are working. So we provide that transparency and even cost savings from if someone's taking multiple products already, because the fact that you're using a single product, we simplify that process, but also in a lot of ways can reduce the spend, because people are buying 10 different products or 5 different products on a monthly basis, and by taking Myoform, we can sort of leverage some of those economies of scale that you wouldn't be able to get from buying single ingredient products. So yeah, hopefully that's a good enough explanation of what people can expect to learn.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And if anybody is interested, I believe you can head over to myoform.io. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah, amazing. I was like trying to visually remember what is your URL. Yeah, .io. I will also be linking the Instagram and Theo's LinkedIn profile for anybody that's been listening today as well. Theo, thank you so much for joining.
Thank you very much for having me.